afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Measuring Engagement in Professional Service Firms. I am your moderator, Megan Lockwood. I'm the head of content at eDynamic, and I'm really thrilled to be joined today by our Director of Digital Strategy, Daniel Huss. Dan has over 11 years of experience solving business problems through digital. Dan is Google Analytics and Onetoone certified, and we actually cherry-picked Dan from the entrepreneurial world after he successfully sold his own agency. So Dan has spent a lot of time looking at exactly what we're talking about today. And as you can see, he's also a handsome fellow. In today's presentation, we will cover what engagement is, what you need to do to set up a measurement plan at your own company, and what insights you can glean from digital. And we'll also have a question and answer session at the end. So please chat us your questions, and we'll make sure to answer them immediately in real time. So without further ado, here's Dan.
Thank you, Megan. Yes, I might be a little bit self-serving in how I created this slide. Folks, as we go through this, feel free to use my Twitter handle and live tweet me during the show. And of course, my email address is up, and you're welcome to email me before, after the presentation, during the presentation. So I would definitely encourage as much communication as possible. So I think we've kind of tricked you a little bit in the sense that I don't think we're really going to be talking about engagement today. We are actually doing this is a timeshare presentation. No, I'm just kidding. My point with engagement is that it's kind of a buzzword, and it's hard to measure. I'm not even really sure what engagement is. And I think, when we think about the dictionary definition of an engagement, a formal agreement to get married, an arrangement to go somewhere or do something at a fixed time, it doesn't really encapsulate really what it means to measure what is appropriate and important to your business on the web. Because each business is unique, it's also nearly impossible to define engagement in any kind of standardized way. And that's why I kind of would like to shy away from that word. Another reason is that it just isn't useful. I think we've gotten stuck in this pattern where we'll get communication, hey, we need to be measuring engagement, we need to increase engagement, but because of the ill definition that surrounds it, we just don't know what that is, how to make it useful, and largely that's because, again, there's no context. We're missing this element of context around my business and around what's important and the way that users want and need to interact with me online. And to understand kind of where we need to go if we're moving away from the word engagement and moving into insights that are actually going to be useful for us, it's going to be a little bit helpful to talk about the way that communication has evolved throughout the business world. And to kick that off, let's start back in where someone would go to a general store, for instance, to purchase something. In this scenario, they're making a purchase and they're having one-to-one communication with the person at this shop. If I wanted to buy a shovel, I went and I probably knew the guy that I bought a shovel from. And I would ask him questions about the shovel. Will this shovel dig a hole? Does it come with a handle? I'm not really sure what aspects are important to shovels. I live in Manhattan, but you get the point that he's going to be able to give me information about shovels on a one-to-one basis. It was a guy, of course it's a guy asking about the handle shovel. And we really moved from a one-to-one communication to a one-to-many communication style when we hit the Industrial Revolution. We now had major advertisements going out saying, buy my stuff in masses. We weren't really necessarily interested in getting additional feedback, and this worked for a long time. Whoever created this ad for the Edison phonograph sent this out to numerous people without the expectation that they were going to be able to measure or understand people's engagement with this ad. They may have a loose correlation with understanding whether or not it increased business over that time period, but that was about as far as they could take it, and even chances are they weren't measuring that. Now jump ahead, and there's definitely some communications phases in between the Industrial Revolution and where we are today, but the internet has done this crazy thing, and it's really making us go back to this one-to-one communication level, where we're developing individual communications for individual groups of people, and almost for individuals themselves. Now, but this isn't like the one-to-one communication style that existed really in the pre-industrial revolution with the guy going and buying a shovel, because we still really have one company, but they're developing many types of communication. The other way that it's kind of different is that the companies that are developing all this information that they're sending out on a one-to-one basis, it's not an instantaneous conversation. This conversation is actually taking place over a long period of time. It kind of looks like this. A user begins the conversation by coming to our website. We get information about what they like, or presumably about what they like, about what types of information they're looking at on the website. I think that's the kind of assumption that we try to make. Based off of that information, we try to create more information that they like. Then the user reads the new information, and we tell whether or not they like it again, and they begin that conversation funnel all over again with us. Now, in this sense, we're trying to generate as personalized content to them as possible, but this conversation could take place over weeks or months depending on how we're actually measuring those cycles. It's not an instantaneous conversation, but it does create a feedback loop in which via their behavior on our within the digital world, and maybe not just even on our website, but within social and how they're interacting with our email programs, we create this feedback loop where their behavior is basically like them communicating with us. And one of the main problems with this is it generates a lot of information. And we get that information in big chunks. What if one reader, as part of this cycle, really loves the information that we created? I mean, I think they might get lost in that. Is that important to know that one reader really loves the information that we have? And what does it even mean when we talk about what it is that that one reader likes? Well, this is all part of a conclusion that a very great data advocate has come to. All data in aggregate is crap. From Avinash Kaushik, who's kind of been hailed as the modern leader in analytics. And this is an important point because it means that when we look at our data, we really need to make sure that we're doing with it that in the ways that are important. And I think here's a couple examples. Visitors spend 3 minutes on our site. 60% leave without going to another page. We got 60,000 page views last month. This is the type of information that on the surface you're probably pulling from your analytics package, whether that's Google or Omniture or Web Trends. But visitors spending 3 minutes on our site, what does that mean? There's no context. Is that good? Is that bad? How do we compare that to something? 60% leave without going to another page. Again, is that a good metric? I think that's a big question that we always want to ask. Yeah, and Megan, to your point, when we're looking at this, we really need to be able to compare it to something, and I think we'll be able to address that a little bit later. But these numbers are kind of meaningless without any kind of context around them. And this results, when you bring this up to leadership or to the business teams, they go, oh, cool story. Thanks. I've got information. I'm not really sure what to do with it. So how do we solve this? I think really what we're talking about here is we're getting a large sum of information, and what you really need to know as marketers is that this very small chunk, this very segmented chunk, and maybe this chunk isn't the same chunk that someone else within your company needs to know, such as leadership or other business divisions. And this brings me to probably the first major point of this when we're talking about what we're really measuring when we're measuring engagement, and that's outcomes. We're looking at that subset of data, and instead of calling it engagement, let's call it what it really is. It's outcomes that we're setting based off of what we've now deemed as important to our businesses. Specific outcomes that we then make assumptions on the degrees to which users have a relationship with your brand through the website. And when we talk about your overall brand, I think it's important to kind of relate that back to digital, because digital is such a large touch point. And one way that we measure on a high level someone's relationship with your overall brand is really first whether or not they own your product, whether or not they're engaged with your services. If they are engaging with your services, they now have clearly seen enough value at least initially in what you are selling to pay you large sums of money to actually utilize those services. Now, this is not necessarily a measure of positive or negative interaction, but it's a fairly obvious way to know that they are in a relationship with your brand. They are utilizing your services. So when we're thinking about the website, I think we kind of need to change the way that we think about a website from a marketing experience to a product experience. If your website is a product, what are your customers paying you with? Obviously, when they're actually engaging in your services, they're paying you in cold hard cash, I hope, or Bitcoin, as maybe things are going the direction the world might be going, who knows. But when we think about this now, think about the value that your website is giving that is completely independent of your actual service. And oftentimes that comes in the form of information. You're giving education to the users that come to your website via your content strategy. Well, when we look at that information or education in terms of a product in and of itself, what are our users ultimately paying us in consuming that? And it's these three things, really. We like to bucket it into these kind of three buckets. And I know you're going to say, Dan, that these are the things that make up engagement. But if these are the things that make up engagement, let's just call them what they are. Let's remove that from our vocabulary, simply because it's such a broad term that we should really be referring to the metrics that are directly impacting and important to our business. Let's take the time to say unique visitors are something that's important from an acquisition standpoint. Which channels are they coming from? Social? Are email campaigns? Are they coming from referrals across the web? And I think the next category of behavior is, I think, what people typically think of when they think of engagement. Visitor loyalty. Are they frequently coming back to the site? What is the recency of their visit? Bounce rate. Are they quickly and immediately finding value in what they see enough that they're staying and going deeper into content? And what I think is most important about what you should be thinking and starting with when you are talking about measuring this so-called level of engagement are really these outcome measures that you need to define as an organization. When visitors come to your website, what should they do? This is the first question that you need to answer. What should visitors do on your website? And what should they see? Now, going back to Avinash Kaushik's point that all this data in aggregate is not very useful, when we go in and say what should they do and what should they see, you're going to get different answers from different places. So really, to make this data useful and to actually make those metrics that I brought up in that last slide actionable, you have to segment. Now, having done campaigns across numerous professional services firms, data segmentation can mean lots of things. You can segment based off of users. You can segment based off of regions. We've got a lot of global firms that typically will segment data across, how is our European data performing versus how is our U.S. data performing. But specifically, my experience within professional services is that you should start data segmentation directly within your business divisions. So what does a business division mean? A couple examples, for example, practice areas in your law firm. Practice areas are obviously very, very interested in what's going on the website. It's a critical area for them to communicate what their practice area is about. And they also are very curious. They create a lot of content, and they're curious to see within those that content, is that driving people to go engage with their attorneys?
We were talking to a law firm the other day too about their bio pages, because for a law firm, often their content, their thought leadership is their people. So that's another example, I think, of a really good example of good content and engagement, what you would measure for a law firm.
Yeah, they're really concerned, and if they're working really hard on developing on all this content, you know, it's important to each individual practice area that they're determining whether that content is resulting in someone going and evaluating their attorneys. Sales teams are also another very, very critical area across professional services. Your sales team is very frequently kind of the first experience that someone might have with your brand, and the sales teams themselves might be creating content or putting in requests to the marketing department about sending out an email blast, and they would like to know, I'm sure they have their own sets of data about what they would like to see, whether or not this is performing, and that kind of really speaks to the acquisition side of things. And the outcome side of things. Are we driving unique visitors to the website through this email campaign? Is that email campaign resulting in an outcome that me as a salesperson cares about? Also for professional services, the specific teams that develop your product. When we've got a new product launch or new service offering launch, which I think is a frequent thing that happens, are we creating the right types of content? Are people going to that content and consuming it in the way that we would expect them to consume it? Continuing with pulling some specific metrics that might be useful to a law firm, particularly in the sense that law firms, you know, while each one of their businesses is definitely very unique, they've got some very specific things that each one cares about. So if we're talking about a practice area, they care largely about unique visitors from an acquisition standpoint that are going to their specific practice section. So when we're looking at the data in Google Analytics, let's carve out their practice area that exists on the website. So that's, you know, www.mylawfirm.com/practice area I care about and related pages. What types of unique visitors are going there? How did they get there? We sent out an email campaign that we requested from marketing. Did that email campaign, was that one of the channels that actually drove? Did it work? From a behavior standpoint, these practice areas obviously care a lot about what their existing clients are doing. So repeat visits to practice area content. I'm creating all this content. Are the people that I'm creating it for and actually my existing clients going there and consuming it on a regular basis? Are they consuming new information? Of course, they really want to know about the bounce rates. That 60% bounce rate that we talked about, is that site-wide or is that specifically for a practice area? And we're going to talk about context in just a minute and how that relates, but I think that's something very important that the individual practice areas would want to know. And outcomes, social amplification. Is this content that I'm creating and spending so much time and energy to make going to be shared? At what rate is it being shared, and is that good or bad? And again, let's set an outcome of recency. Let's try to get folks returning to our practice area based off of the content schedule that we've created and how often we produce content every 3 days or every 2 days. Let's set a metric around that as far as an outcome, measure that, because that's something that's important to you. When we go through this isn't a lot of metrics. This is 6 different metrics that can give me quick insight into how my section in the digital world is performing. This is something that a practice area can have and then be able to look at on a regular basis, maybe weekly, maybe bi-monthly, and make decisions about whether or not they should continue to do the frequency of content that they have, whether or not they need to refresh individual parts that are explaining what their practice area is, say their bounce rate is unusually high. They can then make decisions and incrementally change those. And of course, visitor recency, just showing a quick example of what this might look like in the context of the practice area in a law firm. They might want to say that we want people to visit at this frequency, right? And when was the last time that folks actually went in and visited and read our content? So we can see that, you know, the majority of folks in this example pop into the website, and these are the folks that visited the website today. These are the folks that come in through different channels and are visiting our website on that very same day, and have come back numerous times perhaps. Then if you go down in terms of recency, we now see here are the folks who have visited our website, you know, it's been a day. Here are the folks that came back 2 days ago. And we start to get a picture of this concept of engagement by looking at their behaviors in terms of how frequently and recently they're coming back.
Well, and I was going to say, then you can also see if you make a change, say you go to publish a blog every 2 days or every 3 days, does that change the visitor recency?
That's exactly, yeah, you can make, again, decisions when looking at this data over a set of time about whether or not you need to publish more often, or maybe publishing more often isn't helping, and you don't necessarily need to spend as much time developing content as you think, or maybe you need to create more. So make sure that you're discussing internally which business divisions have a stake within your website and are frequent contributors, or at least frequent consumers of digital information, and segment your data to them. They're going to ask you things like, typically they'll want to know, are people reading what I'm writing? Are my clients specifically reading my content? These are the types of questions that they're going to ask you, and this is how you can begin to really start to segment your data within your professional services firm. Look at those practice areas, look at business development or sales, and at least at the very highest level, look in terms of regional differences between how people are behaving on your website and consuming content. This is all very good, though, in the sense that it gives us kind of a snapshot picture. But again, we're trying to make decisions in terms of whether or not this level of consumption and these outcomes are high or low. What is the degree? And to arrive at that, we need to understand those metrics that we picked a couple slides up from here, those bounce rate metrics, those acquisition metrics. We need to understand their contextualized position. Again, I'm using the word degree here very, very carefully, because there's this concept of degree versus kind of measuring that we'll get into in just a moment. But we're really thinking about the degree to which people are consuming content. And we do this by calculating averages. We look at the minimums and maximums via the data that we have. So if I have 100 practice areas within my law firm, I'm going to pick practice area number 1. I'm going to calculate the average bounce rate within that section. I'm going to look back through my data given a time period. Probably you know, a year period would be good. If you have longer data, that's also good to look at. What was the minimum bounce rate that took place during that time period? What was the maximum bounce rate that took time during that time period? And I'm going to compare in several different ways versus these averages, minimums, and maximums. And two ways that you can do this very effectively is you can compare one to time period. And there's some interesting things when you compare to time period. I bet if you all looked at your data right now, you would see week-to-week variations. You're going to see drops in visits on Saturday and Sunday, probably peak visits maybe around Wednesday or Thursday, and then it starts to decline as the weekend comes again. Now, you can compare that from year to year or month to month, but when we're thinking about trying to change these metrics and why contextualizing them is important is because we really want to understand a benchmark against ourselves. Are the actions we are taking now making a difference? Did our bounce rate go down via the changes we made this month in comparison to last month? And there are some ways to do that, and I know that one of those ways is simple A/B testing. But if you're just starting to get into the realm of should we create more content or how do we make changes on the website, you can look at these from month to month and look at these very high-level metrics and make very intuitive decisions based off of whether things go up and down on the changes that you have made. The other way that you can contextualize and compare this data is to other content. Now, I don't want to pit necessarily practice area in law firms against practice area, but one benchmark would be, well, if we have one practice area with a bounce rate of 40% and one practice area with a bounce rate of 60%, we can start to understand the differences in the way that they're behaving online, maybe in the content that they're creating or in the way that they're framing the content when people get to that site for the first time in terms of messaging. And we're able to make decisions and use their learnings that they may have done consciously or stumbled on purely by accident to drive our decisions in our practice areas. And I think sales people can definitely do the same when they're comparing, my sales practice versus someone else's sales practice in terms of actual service offerings.
And it also, that will give you insight on the type of person that's buying for you, because often someone that's going to be looking for an actuarial accountant or is looking for a high-level tort reform is going to be very different than someone who's looking for disability. And they're going to need a different type of writing and a different type of conversion, and that will give you insight comparing content to another on what kind of audience you're dealing with on your website.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, as I mentioned earlier, segmenting by your audience is another way, and it starts to get a little bit tricky and a little bit more advanced when we start looking at our audience. And I would encourage you all to start thinking about personas. And this is definitely going to be a future eDynamic webinar that I hope you all attend. But you can start using whether or not individual types of buyers are how they interact with content differently, because you're going to know, to Megan's point, what type of buyer is going to what section of the site. Now, I talked very, very carefully about using the word degree because degrees are extremely important. We talked about, as an example, we're averaging 6,000 visitors per day. Now, when we compare that to the next practice area over, or when we compare that to the year before, is that higher or lower? And then we can use that to make decisions. So this is another example, just quickly going through these, of how you can put real metrics to this and measure against these. These are kind of like your benchmarks that you want to continually optimize against. I like to use the words, we iterate repeatedly. Email, did that email campaign work? What channels did people come through? Maybe 60% of our traffic to our practice area is through organic, 20% through referral, 20% through something like AdWords or some other advertising campaign. Repeat visits to our practice area, 6 per month. This is our average. Now, are the things we're doing, did this next month, did we get 8 or 9 additional visits? By increasing the number of publications that we did that increase the amount of repeat visits to our specific practice area? And bounce rate we've talked about in quite a bit of detail. Did those changes to our practice area's landing page make a difference versus our average? You're really benchmarking against yourself here. Now, if you're able to find industry benchmarks, for instance, we know that average bounce rates across the web, about 50%. That's probably a fair thing to say. It certainly varies via industry, but it's about 50%. If you're able to find those industry benchmarks, I would encourage you to take a look at them, but by no means should you be making core decisions on industry benchmarks. Benchmark against yourself. That's how you really start to optimize. Same with things like these outcomes that we've chosen. And these are things that I like to call micro-conversions here because we're not talking about generating a direct sale from these outcomes. We're talking about a specific goal that we're setting. Currently, our site, in this example, in this practice area, is averaging 5 shares per pieces of content. What types of changes can we do to increase that? Maybe we can call out within the context of the actual piece of content that we made, specifically asking people to share. Will that make a difference? Will it go up or down? And we've also talked about the recency of returning visits to that practice area. An average percentage of people, when we looked at that slide up above, of people that come back 1 or 2, 3, 4, 5 days later. Really, we're talking about the degree. Is it higher or lower? And again, that's super important to make note of, because it's, again, the concept of degree versus kind of interaction. Degree tells us how much. Again, was it high? Was it low? Kind of interaction talks about, was it positive or was it a negative interaction? Typically, web data that we pull from our social platforms, that we pull from our email campaigns, that we pull from Google Analytics, that cannot tell you positive or negative interactions on your site. Now, degree can give you some sort of inference. If we've got users returning in terms of frequency on a regular basis, that can kind of give us some insight to maybe they're probably having a positive experience with that type of content. So let's make an inference about that. Let's say that the more that they're coming there, we can kind of infer that they're having a little bit more of a positive experience. But otherwise, it's not necessarily possible to judge directly those positive or negative experiences. Lots of outcomes or little outcomes, positive or negative, when we want to measure kind. And this is going to be, again, another eDynamic webinar that I hope you attend coming up. Really, you're going to have to start doing a survey for your web. And we'll talk much more in detail in that future webinar about how to craft that survey, what types of questions to ask, and how to conduct it so that you're getting the right information from the people that are visiting your site.
Another thing we've done in the past is actually do an NPS or something like that on the content piece, which I always think is interesting. NPS is Net Promoter Score, so you can actually ask people to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 the types of content and how valuable they found it, and I think that's another way to get to kind a little bit. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, Net Promoter Score helps you arrive at the thought, well, if they have a positive experience with your site, they're likely to be a promoter of it, and that's where we get into things like they become evangelists for your brand, and they want to share it. So I'm looking forward to this next webinar where we talk more in more detail about this. I'd like to summarize quickly the steps that we've gotten to and the way that you should be thinking about engagement so that we can put this word aside and use it when we're talking to our leadership and chuckle to ourselves that this is what we really mean when we're talking about that. First, step number 1. When we talk about engagement, we're talking about outcomes. What do you want your website to do? Let's define that. Make sure you define that, the next step, in a segmented way. Segment those. Define what you want your website to do for your sales team, what you want your website to do for your individual practice area, what you want your website to do for your service offering / product teams, and come up with those individual metrics that are relevant to them. Finally, after you've segmented that, contextualize them. Create an average version of them. And then that average allows you to compare whether or not they're going up or going down. I'd like to, again, thank you all for joining us for our webinar. I hope that you've found that as riveting as I find data. I tend to love to geek out on this. We are now going to open the webinar up to questions, and I hope to hear from a lot of you.
Dan and I spend a lot of time geeking out over data, so I think it's a lot of fun. I just want to thank Dan Huss so much. This is really a terrific, I learned from this, so I think it's really helpful, and I hope that you guys send us your questions. So let's see what we have, a few of them. The first question from Robert is there a way to see what's sending my website visitors away?
Yeah, so the question was, is there a way that I can tell what is turning visitors away from my website? And I think we talked in some length about bounce rate, and I think that's a pretty solid metric for that. But when we, again, talk about turning your visitors away, we kind of need to know where they're landing. So we now have to segment by landing page. So we need to look at bounce rate segmented by landing page or section. If they're landing on one individual part of the site, and the bounce rate is 70%, and landing on another user lands on a different part of the site, the bounce rate is, say, 40%. What are the differences between those? Does that mean that the 70% landing page is not getting people to the, it wasn't the information that they expected, so they decided to leave? That's possible. So you're able to look, and again, you're able to, one, define what was important, and in this case, you've defined it as people leaving my site. Two, you're segmenting it based off of landing pages. And three, you're creating an average, and then you can compare that average bounce rate to each other, comparing one landing page to another to see what's more effective.
Great. Here's about social media. What are some effective tools to measure social media analytics?
Yeah, hot topic. Who doesn't love social right now? I think, and I mean, and not just social, but cross-channel analytics is very big. But in context of social, I like to use 3 different metrics, and I hope you have a pen ready because I'm going to describe them really quickly for you. The first metric is amplification rate, which we specifically called out in this presentation, and that is simply the measure of shares per post. If I've posted twice and I've had 20 shares total, I'm getting an amplification rate of 10 shares on average per post. Again, I'm taking that data and I'm contextualizing it to its average to understand whether or not one post is performing better than another post when I look at individuals. The next social metric is applause rate. And similar to amplification rate, except for shares, we're talking about likes or favorites in the case of Twitter. How many likes per post are we getting? And the last one is conversation rate. How many comments, how many direct messages are we getting per post that we put up? So again, that's amplification rate, applause rate, and conversation rate. And the tool, there's a great tool out there. It's free up to a certain amount. Is called TrueSocialMetrics.com. What you do is you go in, you sign up for a TrueSocialMetrics.com account, and you're able to then link your different social channels to it, and it covers a huge variety of social channels, and it will automatically calculate that data for you, those 3 metrics, your applause, amplification, and conversation rate.
Awesome. What about, for those of us with a CRM, can we integrate our marketing automation with analytics platforms so that we can get some kind of, well, this is a good question, consolidated customer insight?
Yeah, okay, so this is getting kind of at the heart of when we're trying to talk about the whole amorphous concept of engagement, of cross-channel analytics and being able to make this stuff actionable. So the question is, can we integrate our CRM and marketing automation platforms with our website to get increased insights? And the answer is a resounding yes. And when we're talking about things like marketing automation, we want to know, and going back again to, for example, maybe a practice area in a law firm, they might want to know if an email communication goes out, not just the open rates of that email communication and how many people click through to the website, but after they clicked through to the website, what it is that they're actually going to do. And modern content management systems are pretty good about aggregating that data, but there's also very good ways in things like Onetoone and Google Analytics to set that up. For example, in Google Analytics, there's a thing called the URL builder, where you're able to append UTM data to the end of the link, where you can specify campaign that that email is a part of, medium that it is email, and source. So when someone clicks on that link, it is transferring that information based in that URL back to your Google Analytics account. If you just Google Google URL Builder, you'll be able to find it and be able to pull more information on it. And then, of course, let's connect something like Salesforce or your CRM into that data so that we can see what's happening in terms of conversion rates from when someone filled out a contact form. And you can start to do some very powerful things once you know conversion rates that are coming from a website. You can start putting dollar values to these things. Every lead that comes in from the website I know is worth $1,000 to me. And then if you want to get really creative, I could then say back in, and because I know conversion rates and I know that every lead is worth $1,000, I could then say something like, every visitor to my website is worth $1. So that's a pretty powerful thing to do.
I've had teams where we actually had like an SLA, an agreement with the sales team that we owed $40,000 worth of leads every month. And we could get to that a bunch of different ways, but it would be, 2,000 pieces of X content or 150 different, downloads of a certain demo form or something like that. So you actually can do some really interesting pieces just following and doing an API into Salesforce, so you know the close rates too.
Absolutely.
Great. So another question is about how you share the information with stakeholders. So the question is, how do you suggest we share analytics with our stakeholders or colleagues? And then after that, is there a way to automate that?
Yeah, so how do we get information into the hands of the people that care about it? How do we share as a marketing department? How do we take the information that we're starting to generate and get it into their hands, and then make it so that we don't have to manually fill out an Excel spreadsheet or these reports every day? We call this concept a dashboard, and here at eDynamic this is something that we love to develop for clients. And within a modern CMS, typically you're able to create dashboards. I know Sitecore has some very, very deep dashboarding capabilities where you can pull in this information, make it user-specific, so when a user logs into that dashboard, they only see the information that they care about, and then it is automatically handled within the content management system and automatically updated for them once you've set those parameters. So that something like that can happen in Sitecore. Google Analytics makes that a little bit more difficult. If you want to start automating dashboards from Google Analytics, you need to create scripts, very custom scripts that pull that data into a dashboard. That is something that I think typically a partner would need to do for you. It's a very specialized type of capability. But other platforms like WebTrends and Omniture, they also, similar to your content management system, they also allow these kind of very customized dashboards based off of the multiple types of channel data that you're pulling in.
And knowing I've allowed stakeholders to approve, dashboards are a really, really helpful thing. Okay, so Mary wants to know about predictive behavior. Is it possible to predict prospect behavior on the basis of historical analytics? And if yes, how effective do you think that really is?
Good question, Mary. That's kind of getting a little bit into the realm of big data, and I think big data is another one of those buzzwords that kind of goes around. My advice is that I like to still think of companies struggling with small data. But yes, it is possible to start getting predictive data. And at the very basic level, if you're able to look at simply visits to your website, you can predict seasonality from year to year. And I think we talked earlier about a weekly cycle of data where on the weekends, perhaps, you're seeing less traffic than on Wednesday or Thursday. Ways that you can really pull in predictive data are partnering with partners like ComScore or Rapleaf, who are able to connect a user's online profile with other information about them, and you're able to understand that user in a deeper way that can kind of predict things about them. I would recommend that at this stage, you're going to get 80% of the more than that of the knowledge that you need from your web analytics package and be able to make decisions based off of that. That extra 20% would kind of be gravy. But if we're still struggling with pulling simple metrics together, predictive analytics is definitely where the industry is headed. But let's get that baseline first.
I always think about it too. It's what you can measure versus what you should measure and what you will use, because I think that those are sometimes you can measure a lot of things. Whether you'll ever reuse that information, sometimes you can just bury yourself in reports.
I think I'll add one more thing to that, and it kind of just occurred to me as we were discussing this. There's a very cool feature that Google offers for free that's not part of your analytics package called Google Trends. And just Google Trends and play around with that. It's been rated as the most underused but highest valued way to start getting predictive information about what trends are happening within your industry. And if you go in and play around with it for 30 minutes, you'll see what I mean.
And I'm going to give you one last question because I like to know this stuff. And I also think it's helpful to give somebody a takeaway. So we all need action. What's the one thing you would suggest that we do tomorrow to really get your feet wet, maybe tracking engagement?
Right. So yeah, the question is what's that one thing, that first step that we can really kick off to start getting our organization involved in analytics? Well, I think you should take a really hard look at your website and ask that first question that we had in the presentation, what do I want my website to do? And if you can answer that question, you're right on the right track to being able to understand how people are actually utilizing your website. Because once you've got that in place, you know what you need to start tracking. Well, we want our users to look at this type of content. Well, now I know that I need to look at specific metrics, such as something like time on site of how long they're looking at that content, and contextualize that. What's the average time on site that they look at that, and then be able to make those changes. So define what you want your website to do. Ask those sometimes hard questions, and ask those questions of the individual stakeholders within your organization, and that's probably the best first step that you can do.
Thanks, Dan. Well, we have a couple more questions peppering in, but I think we're going to hold off until after this webinar. If you want, you can contact us at contact@edynamic.net, or also you can just tweet Dan, and I'm sure that he'll hang around for another half hour or so and answer any questions that you have at dhusmarketect.
dhusmarketect, yes, I'll definitely respond well to your tweets, unlike lately with, I don't know if anyone saw the U.S. Airlines or U.S. Airways fiascos that are going on, but I promise we won't have that kind of drama if you follow me on Twitter or tweet with me.
I promise we won't have that. Thank you all so much for attending the webinar. We hope you really found it informative and that we follow up with questions on an ongoing basis. The recording for today's webinar will be available on our website within 3 business days, and we'll also send you and share the webcast URL in case you want to come back and double check the questions or use some of the slides for another presentation. We'll send that to you via email. Again, please feel free to reach out and contact us at danhus@edynamic.net or contact@edynamic.net, and we hope that you have a wonderful afternoon. Thanks so much.
Thank you all. Really enjoyed presenting to you.